Okay, showtime. Well, hello, folks. Thanks for tuning in. This is going to be the first installment of our new deal here on this channel. And the first book we're going to start with is actually the second book I wrote. And the title of it is The White Elephant's Gold. And I'll give a little explanation to the way that title came about. Here's a picture of the book, and this is the softcover edition. And the picture on the front of the book, or the cover actually, is pretty much the same picture you'll see while the video's playing. It doesn't change. It's just the picture of the front of the book. Actually, it's the picture of the front of the audio book because they have to have a different size picture, and to me, it's a better picture. But what that is actually a picture of, it's a desert scene, but it's real. I took it myself, and it is a picture of the White Elephant's Wash, which is a real a wash that's created out here in Arizona from the runoff of small mountain ranges. And it's actually where people go and prospect for gold. And I've been out there many a time and found a little bit of gold, a few flakes, but nothing large to speak of. But anyhow, the picture is a real picture, and it's the picture of the White Elephant's Wash. So that explains that. Now, let me give you just a brief description. David, who is the main character in the book, was just a weekend prospector until one day he made the find of a lifetime. He soon discovered that keeping his treasure was going to be harder than finding it. A story of gold fever with a little revenge, torture, and goodwill sprinkled on top. Okay, so today we're going to do chapters 1 through 3, and I hope you enjoy the story. The White Elephant's Gold. Written by W.R. Bottoms. Narrated by W.R. Bottoms. Chapter 1. David Johnson sat in his truck surveying the harsh landscape before him. David was a weekend prospector and was looking for a new place to dig for gold. He had been doing this for over a year now and was starting to get the hang of it. But it was still hard to pick a specific spot. The uninviting Arizona desert looked the same in every direction. David's truck was parked on some high ground in the middle of what geologists called an alluvial fan, which is caused by the runoff of two small mountain ranges. The main channel of the fan was named the White Elephant Wash. David often wondered why someone had named it that, or why anyone had went to the trouble of naming it at all, for that matter. To David, it was just a dry creek bed, which might have a little water in it once a year. He guessed the early map makers must have had a lot of spare time and liked to name things. Chapter 2. David was born and raised in central Texas, so to him there were ditches, creeks, and rivers in that order. But out here in the Arizona desert, there were just washes and rivers. David tried his best to change his terminology so he would fit in. But every now and then he would slip up, and then he would get a strange look from the person he was talking to. When David first moved to Arizona, his co-workers had warned him about the dangers of washes and how many people drowned in them each year. David couldn't quite understand this, but he had not yet seen a wash with running water in it, so he thanked his co-workers for their advice. Later that year, in the monsoon season, as the locals called it, the rains finally came, and the washes filled with running water. To David, they looked the same as the drainage ditches in Texas that he had played in as a child. David was still confused on this issue. When he told his co-workers about playing in them as a child, they asked how he kept from drowning. David's best reply was, "Well, we could swim." This seemed to anger most of them, so David just let the subject drop. David's co-workers and neighbors also warned him about the rattlesnakes in Arizona and how much more aggressive and poisonous they were than the ones in Texas. After the episode with the Warshes, David just thanked them for their advice and said nothing else. David looked at the almost never-ending series of small hills separated by small washes. Finally, he picked a spot that to him looked promising. He drove his truck over to the spot and back down the hill as far as he dared. David got out and strapped on his pistol that he took for protection. The gun was a Smith & Wesson .44 Magnum, Model 29, with an 8-inch barrel. The barrel was so long, David had to put the holster low on his thigh like the gunfighters in the old westerns. He did this not so he could quick draw it, but because most of the time prospecting was spent either on one's knees or crouched down digging. Most people told him the .44 Magnum was a little overkill. But there were bears and mountain lions in this area, and since David usually came alone, better to be safe than sorry. He retrieved his small pick and shovel from the bed of the truck and started walking up the wash. In David's short time as a prospector, he had found more gold upstream than downstream. As David walked, he noticed small holes here and there where other prospectors had tried and gave up. Most of them were in the easy-to-dig sand in the middle of the wash. David chuckled to himself as he walked by these. He had learned that there were seldom any gold in the loose sand in the middle of the washes, and to just have a chance, you had to dig deep enough to reach the layer of caliche the locals called bedrock. These holes were only about 8 inches deep. About 3 more feet and you might have found something, David thought to himself. As David walked further up the wash, the small holes disappeared. Most prospectors didn't stray far from their vehicles. David was about 300 feet from his truck now, and the sides of the wash were completely vertical and went up at least 20 feet. He inspected these closely. He was looking for a layer of red clay mixed with gravel. David didn't know why, nor did he question it, but he had found more gold in this kind of dirt than any other. As the wash started to make a bend, David saw a little red start to appear at the base of the wall. As he rounded the corner, the red became more apparent and increased in thickness. On the wall of the wash, the water had cut an alcove into the red clay. It was fairly large and went under the side of the wash about 5 feet. David looked at the small cave and at the 20 feet of loose dirt above it. He knew the top could collapse at any time, but because it was cut into the red clay, he had to take a look. David got down on his knees and inched up to the mouth of the cave. It was dark inside, and he had no flashlight. He inched a little closer to the mouth of the small cave. David noticed some movement out of the corner of his eye, and since he had been poised for the cave to collapse at any moment, he sprang backwards just as a large rattlesnake struck at him. The snake missed David and recoiled back into the cave, then started rattling its tail. "Oh, now you start rattling," David said to the snake. David moved back away from the cave and let the adrenaline rush subside a little. He then started throwing rocks into the cave. The rattlesnake could not stand much of this, and soon slid out of the cave and down the wash looking for a more peaceful place to get out of the sun. Taking no chances, David stuck his shovel into the cave and thrashed it around violently. Nothing else appeared, so David again inched his way into the opening. He crawled about halfway in and stopped to let his eyes adjust to the darkness. When he could see a little better, David took out a small pick and began picking at the side of the cave so he could get a sample to pan. Just as David got enough for a sample, the top of the cave gave way. David started to push himself backwards, but a large rock fell on his right leg just below his knee. David felt a sharp and severe pain, and then a small rock caught him on the back of the head. David saw a few stars, and then total blackness. When David came to, it took him a while to regain his wits and recall what had happened. He opened his eyes and coughed up some dust. He looked around to survey his situation. Luckily for David, the whole roof of the cave had not collapsed. It appeared only some of the large rocks had come loose from the cave ceiling. There was still daylight coming in from the half-blocked-off entrance. With a lot of effort and some severe pain from his right leg, David was able to turn onto his right side. His legs were covered with rocks and dirt from his knees down to his feet. David moved and shook his left leg in an effort to free it from the dirt. As the dirt fell away, David pushed some of the dirt around his body away from him. This gave him more room to work. He reached up and wiped the sweat from his face, only to discover most of it was blood. He felt the back of his head where the rock had struck him and found a decent-sized lump. The skin felt as if it was just a severe scratch, one that would not require stitches. David was not alarmed at the sight of blood, because for the last few years he had been taking 1 aspirin a day on his doctor's orders. The doctor said it would thin his blood and help his heart. David had noticed now that any time he just got a scratch, he bled like a stuck pig. David wiped the blood on his shirt and continued working his way out of the cave. David worked until he could start pushing himself backwards out of the cave. Every inch brought a stab of pain from his right leg. David figured it was at least broken. David inched himself backwards about 3 feet. When he got to the pile of debris that had been piled on his legs, he began pushing it to the side. While doing this, he uncovered a rock about the size of a loaf of bread. David assumed this was what broke his leg. Although it was small and had fallen only about a foot from the top of the cave, David guessed it must have hit his leg at just the right angle to break it. He took his hand and tried to push the rock out of the way. It didn't budge. He took both hands and pushed. The rock slid about 1 inch. He tried to lift the rock, but was only able to get it about 1 inch off the cave floor. The prospector in David kicked in, and his eyes lit up, because he knew no matter what, something this small and this heavy was valuable, even if it was just a meteorite. David inched backwards a little further so he could get a better look at the rock. David spat onto the corner of the rock and wiped it clean with his hand. What he saw brought on a rush of adrenaline that woke his nerves up and made his leg and head hurt all the more. David didn't care about the pain. He was focused on the white quartz with thick gold veins running through it. The adrenaline rush gave David a burst of energy, and he pushed himself free from the cave, dragging the rock with him. When he got clear of the cave and back into the sunlight, David wiped more of the dirt off the rock. His adrenaline shot up again because in the sunlight there was no question about it. This was a chunk of white quartz with large veins of gold running through it. David made himself stop and take some deep breaths. He had to be smart about this. His leg was broken at the very least. The temperature would reach over 100 degrees soon. David also knew he was on the Bureau of Land Management's land. Although he was on a recorded gold claim, most of the gold people found here were small flakes and occasionally a small nugget. Nothing for the government to get excited about. But David had a suspicion that if anyone ever found something big, the government would swoop down on them like hungry vultures. David looked around, assessing his situation. His truck wasn't far away, so he left the rock where it was and crawled to his truck. There was some scrap lumber in the back of the truck, and with this and some duct tape that David had in the toolbox, he made himself a splint for his leg. With the help of this splint and another longer shovel, David was able to hobble back to the cave. He dragged the gold-bearing rock over to the center of the wash to a gravel bar. Small bushes and weeds grew on the gravel bar. This told David that no one had dug for gold in this area. David had tried these gravel bars when he first started prospecting, but had never found anything in them. He soon realized why nobody dug them. He picked a spot in the middle of the bar and dug down about 2 feet. He then buried the large chunk of quartz. He smoothed the dirt out on top to make it look as untouched as he could. He then piled some brush on top of that, to discourage anyone that might happen along with a metal detector. David then hobbled over to the mouth of the cave. He took his pick and chipped away at the side of the wash above the cave. This collapsed more dirt, and soon the cave was hidden pretty well. David piled some sticks and brush on top of this for good measure. As David hobbled back down to his truck, he took a branch and wiped away his tracks as best he could. David wasn't too concerned, because it was the beginning of summer, and not too many people would brave the heat just for a few flakes of gold. David got in his truck and headed toward town. It was about a 90-minute drive. David didn't know if he could make it, because he was starting to feel a little lightheaded, but he needed to put some distance between him and the gold. The first 5 miles was on a very rough dirt road, and every bump sent daggers of pain up David's leg. Just as he pulled out onto the blacktop, David started seeing white spots flicker in front of his eyes. David knew what this meant and quickly pulled the truck off the road. He was just able to turn the ignition off when all the lights went out again. Chapter 3. David was 49 years old and had lived in Kingston, Arizona for the last 9 years. He worked at a major auto parts store as a counter person. The pay wasn't great, but they had good benefits, and he rented a small 2-bedroom house from an elderly couple. Although it was a small house, it had a large garage and was located on the outskirts of town. David liked the peace and quiet, and the fact that he had no neighbors close by. David did all of the upkeep and maintenance on the house, and the elderly couple would take that off his rent. They were more than happy to do this, because it saved them the trouble of hiring contractors, and they knew David would do a good job, if not better. David had taken up prospecting as a hobby and was starting to get the hang of it. Usually by the end of the year, David would have from $800 to $1,000 worth of gold that he would sell to a local prospecting shop. He was always careful to sell it in small amounts, as to not send up any red flags to the government or the IRS.